Paul signs his letters, open his first letter to the Corinthians, and there it is, in his own voice. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. Now open the Gospel of Matthew, and look for the same thing. You will not find it. When the tax collector Matthew appears in his own Gospel, he is described from the outside, in the third person, a man called Matthew. Turn to the Gospel of John, and the author hides even further. He calls himself only the disciple whom Jesus loved, never a name. This is true of all four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, inside the text. Not one of them signs his name. So where do the names come from? We call them the Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 men, 4 familiar names. But those names are written above the stories, like a label on a folder, not inside them. This is not a fringe claim, and it is not an attack on anyone's faith. Even conservative scholars agree on the basic fact. The 4 Gospels are, in the language of scholars, formally anonymous. The real question is narrower and more interesting. If the writers never signed their work, who attached the names, and when, and how sure can we be? This is the honest story of how 4 anonymous books got 4 famous authors. Let us follow the evidence, carefully and fairly. Before we go further, we have to be careful with one word, anonymous. It sounds like an accusation. It is not. In scholarship, an anonymous text simply means a text that does not name its author inside the writing itself. That is all. It does not mean forged. It does not mean faked. It does not mean invented out of thin air. Plenty of ancient works are anonymous and perfectly genuine. And the Gospels are clearly not invented out of nothing. They draw on earlier material, on stories and sayings that were told and retold and in places written down before these books were composed. Whoever wrote them was working with traditions older than himself. So we need to keep 2 questions apart. The first question is, do the texts name their authors? The answer to that is settled. They do not. A very different question is, can we still work out who wrote them, from outside the text, from early tradition and the manuscripts? That question is open and genuinely debated. The honest version of this story lives in the gap between those 2 questions. The clickbait version collapses them and tells you the Gospels are fakes. They are not fakes. They are unsigned. Keep that distinction in your head, because almost every confusion about this topic comes from losing it. Anonymous means unsigned, nothing more and nothing less. Now, to be fair to the texts, the picture is not perfectly clean. 2 of the Gospels do at moments speak in the first person. Luke opens with a short, polished preface. He addresses a patron, someone he calls Most Excellent Theophilus, and explains that he has investigated everything carefully and decided to write an orderly account. It is a writer's voice, but he never gives his own name. John is stranger still. At the very end, the Gospel says of the beloved disciple, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things, and we know that his testimony is true." And a line later, the text even slips into a single I, saying that if everything Jesus did were written down, the world could not hold the books. So it would be an overstatement to say these Gospels are purely third person, or that those are the only first-person words in them. They are not. But look closely at what those passages do and do not do. Luke claims to have done research. John claims to rest on an eyewitness. Both are remarkable claims. And neither one tells you the writer's name. John goes out of his way to point at an eyewitness source and then leaves that source unnamed. The silence is not an accident of a few missing lines. It runs right through the books. If the names are not inside the text, where are they? They are in the titles. The Gospel according to Matthew. The Gospel according to Mark. These headings sit above the narratives, like the name on the spine of a book, separate from the story they introduce. And here is something even the traditional sources concede. The Old Catholic Encyclopedia, no enemy of the Church, grants plainly that these titles do not go back to the authors themselves. There is a clue in the wording. In Greek, the titles do not say the Gospel of Matthew, the way you would name an author. They say the Gospel according to Matthew, according to... That is an unusual way to put it. It does not read like a signature. It reads like an editor's label, a way of saying, here is the good news in the version handed down through Matthew. Many scholars think that is exactly what it is. A label attached when Christians had more than one gospel in front of them and needed a way to tell them apart. When you have only one account, you do not need to label it. When you have four, you do. So the names are real, and they are old, but they live above the text, in the headings, and the question of when those headings were attached is where the real debate begins. To pin down the headings, you go to the manuscripts, and here you have to be honest in both directions. The earliest surviving copies that carry titles, fragments of papyrus known by numbers like P4, P66, and P75, already have them in that same according to form, and they are strikingly consistent. Wherever a title survives, Matthew is according to Matthew, never according to someone else. Those papyri are often dated to around the year 200, but even that date is contested. The scholar Brent Nongbre has argued that some of them may be considerably later than usually thought, so we should hold the dates loosely. Then comes the correction that cuts the other way. In the great 4th century Bibles, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, the titles were written by the same scribes who copied the text itself. They were not scribbled in later by a different hand. So the popular image of someone centuries later sneaking the names onto a nameless book is too simple. But notice what none of this reaches. The oldest copies we can hold are still generations removed from the original. We do not have the first edition of any gospel, and so the manuscripts cannot tell us the one thing we most want to know, whether the very first copies carried titles or none at all. That gap between the lost originals and our earliest survivors is the whole game. If the manuscripts run out, the other place to look is in the writings of the early church. Who is the first person we can find actually naming a gospel writer? His name is Papias, a bishop in a town called Hierapolis, writing in the early 2nd century. And there is a catch. Papias wrote a 5-book work about the sayings of the Lord, and that work is almost entirely lost. We have his words mainly because 2 centuries later, the historian Eusebius quoted him. What Papias says is fascinating and slippery. He reports a tradition that Mark became the interpreter of Peter and wrote down what he remembered of Peter's preaching accurately, but in Papias's words, not in order. And he says that Matthew compiled the sayings, the logia, in the Hebrew language, and that others translated them as best they could. Now, be careful here. This is a layered chain. Papias is reporting what an elder told him about what Mark did for Peter. It is tradition passed hand to hand, not a contemporary record of someone watching Mark write. And the details do not fit neatly. Our Gospel of Matthew was written in Greek, and it does not read like a translation from Hebrew. So whatever Papias meant by Matthew's Hebrew sayings, it is not obviously the book we now call Matthew. These are the earliest threads we have, and they are thin. Move forward a generation to around the year 150 to the city of Rome. There a Christian philosopher named Justin Martyr is defending the faith. He quotes the gospel stories often, dozens of times. He clearly knows them well, and he never calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Instead, he refers to them with a single phrase, the memoirs of the apostles, a general label, not a list of names. For one school of thought, this is an important clue. If the titles were already fixed and famous, why would a careful writer in the capital of the empire reach for a vague phrase instead of the names? But here, immediately, we have to be fair to the other side. This is an argument from silence, and silence is treacherous. Justin may have had reasons of style. Some scholars, like Martin Hengel, argue that Memoirs of the Apostles was a deliberate, dignified, philosophical way of speaking, aimed at an educated audience, and that it does not prove the names were unknown to him. So Justin is a real data point around the year 150. A major Christian writer is comfortable calling the Gospels the memoirs of the apostles. What that proves, and what it only suggests, is exactly the kind of thing honest people can disagree about. Then, around the year 180, the picture snaps into focus. A bishop named Irenaeus, writing in Gaul, gives us the first surviving text that names all four gospel writers together and ties each gospel to its person: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as a set. In the same work, Irenaeus makes a famous argument. There must be exactly four gospels, he says, no more and no fewer, because there are four corners of the earth and four winds. He is writing against rivals, against teachers like Marcion, who wanted a different, shorter set of scriptures. Two things have to be said carefully about this. First, that four winds argument is about the number four. It is a defense of having exactly four gospels. It is not by itself an argument about who wrote them. Second, being the first writer we can find to record the four names is not the same as proving the names are correct. Irenaeus did not invent them, and he did not single-handedly declare them official. He is reporting a tradition he received, a tradition he clearly believed was old. But with Irenaeus, the fourfold named tradition is firmly in the record. From here on, the Gospels have their authors. The question that remains is how far back, behind Irenaeus, those four names really go. So we arrive at the real debate, and it is narrower than the headlines make it sound. Everyone in this debate agrees on the starting fact. The texts themselves name no author. The fight is not about a hidden signature. Nobody is claiming there is a secret name that the other side is covering up. The fight is about timing. On one side stands much of mainstream critical scholarship associated with writers like Ehrman. On this view, the Gospels first circulated without authors attached, and the names were added during the 2nd century as churches gathered multiple Gospels together and needed to tell them apart. It is a reconstruction, a model that fits the evidence. It is not a documented event that anyone watched happen. On the other side stands a serious minority. Scholars like Martin Hengel, Simon Gathercole, and Richard Bauckham. They point out that every single surviving manuscript with a title carries the same name, in the same form, and that no gospel ever turns up attributed to a rival author. If the books had floated nameless for decades, they argue, you would expect competing names to appear. You do not. So they conclude the titles were attached very early, perhaps from the start. This is not faith versus scholarship. It is scholarship versus scholarship. Two careful camps, reading the same thin evidence and disagreeing honestly about when the names went on. So, who wrote the Gospels? Here is what we can say plainly and honestly. The four Gospels do not name their authors inside the text. The names live in the titles, and those titles are not part of the stories themselves. The first surviving writer to name all four together is Irenaeus, around the year 180, a long time after the books were written. And here's what we cannot say. We cannot say the names are proven false. We cannot say that scribes simply made them up at random. Most critical scholars conclude that we do not know with certainty who wrote these books, and that the traditional attributions are doubtful. A respected minority defends them as early and reliable. Both are honest positions held by serious people. What we are left with is not a scandal and not a cover-up. It is something quieter and in its own way more human. Four accounts of the life of Jesus were written in Greek in the 1st century by authors who did not sign their names. For 100 years, the church carried those books, copied them, argued about them, and slowly labeled them with the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Whether those labels are right is a question the evidence cannot fully close. And we are not sure who wrote this is, in the end, a very old and very honest answer.